All right, thank you all for joining us. We're just going to wait another few minutes while people trickle in. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to China and MENA, New Interests and Approaches. Many thanks to our colleagues across Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, and our guests as well, who are still trickling in at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies for making this panel possible, and also to Andrea Gazzelli, who's with us tonight, and the launch of his new book, Protecting China's Interests Overseas, for sparking the initial conversations that led to this fantastic panel. So we're just gonna wait on 1 second while some folks trickle in, and then we can get started in 1 minute. All right, this is fantastic. So we have over 130 people in the room, so we're just going to get started right now. My name is Sophie Zinzer, and I will be moderating the discussion as a Schwarzman Academy Fellow, hosted by both the Asia Pacific and Middle East and North Africa programs at Chatham House. I'm also based in Hong Kong, like Mohammed Al-Sudari most of the time, and Courtney Fung as well. Today around the table, we are joined by 3 distinguished panelists. Lina Ben Abdullah is the assistant professor at Wake Forest University and a senior associate in the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Her recent book published last year, titled Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, looks at China's multilateral foreign policy in continental Africa and seeks to theorize the power dynamics within the seemingly equal Global South diplomatic relationship. Andrea Gazzelli is the assistant professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University, and is also the head of research of China Med Project, an innovative initiative that reviews Turkish, Chinese, Arabic, Hebrew, Farsi, French, Italian, Greek, and Spanish, I don't know if I'm missing any, media that covers China's relations with the wider Mediterranean region. His recent book, which I already mentioned, systematically explores the origin and evolution of China's approach to defending its interests overseas and the use of China's military specifically to do so. Finally, we have Courtney Fung, who is the associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong. She is also an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. And my personal favorite of her titles is also the associate fellow in the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. Her book on China and intervention in the UN Security Council, Reconciling Status, develops the theory for analyzing the effects of status and China's status dilemma. It draws on an impressive body of primary evidence that includes extensive interviews with primarily UN and Chinese foreign policy experts and uses Chinese language sources. Each panelist will speak for approximately 15 minutes on their area of research, and then we will finally get to open up to questions, but right beforehand, we'll hear remarks from our distinguished discussant, Mohammed Al-Sudari, who's the Senior Research Fellow, brains behind this panel, and head of the Asian Studies Unit at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. He's also, my favorite of his titles, a postdoctoral fellow at the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences here in Hong Kong. So now before I hand it over to Lina first to begin with her remarks, I'd like to give a broad overview of the topic that situates our audience and speakers in contemporary debates on China-MENA relations, as some of you who may attending might not be as familiar with the topic. So since the launch of its sweeping 2013 Belt and Road Policy Initiative, China's economic activity and soft power in the Middle East, which had existed long before, have steadily increased. Most recently in March, a tour by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi of several prominent Middle Eastern capitals, notably Tehran, rekindled Western reporting on how China's presence in the region is potentially threatening Western political interests. A deeper understanding of the bilateral relationships between China and individual MENA countries will become increasingly relevant to geopolitical discourse, as China provides in many ways powerful alternatives to Western leadership, and while MENA's prominence in Western foreign policy continues to decrease. While not so cut and dry as one wealthy government steps in as another steps out, this next phase holistically of China-MENA relations will likely depend on the agency of Middle Eastern governments faced with alternatives to Western-led international order. Today, the Middle East is not only a key supplier of energy products for the Chinese economy, it's also an increasingly important market for engineering companies, trade routes connecting Chinese producers with European markets. Most recently, China's vaccine distribution in MENA is aligning with China's broader strategy, casting itself as a global health leader, and has included partnerships between Chinese vaccines and production facilities in countries across, such as Morocco, the UAE, and Egypt. With COVID already dealing a $224 billion blow to oil exporters from MENA, the extent to which relations with China and MENA region countries in terms of oil wax and wane is an area to watch. A very diverse geographic region in and of itself, MENA's population of 400 million people means that 1/3 of the population are aged between 15 and 29, and the region's population is already expected to double by 2060. This makes the composition of its population young and constituting a large market for Chinese goods and services. China is also showing alternative ways to think about journalism, legitimating the presence of state-led outlets. And as Lena herself alluded to in a recent webinar, Chinese policymakers may be approaching peace and security in stark contrast to the terms defined by a liberal peace. On the China side, economic interests and security policy do remain critical challenges to Chinese policymakers. Some would say more so in MENA than anywhere else in the world. The CCP has kept many of its most lucrative trade deals in MENA quietly under the radar, suggesting that China does not seek to enmesh itself deeply in the region's complex local politics, but may intend to exert influence therein. And at the same time, the many old and new crises in the region are at the center of debates about the future of international politics, and more broadly, global diplomacy, especially regarding the future of norms of sovereignty and the responsibility to protect. As Chinese, American, and MENA-based interests all seek to diversify, so too do their tools of statecraft and the and methods that each government use to protect and further them. Thus, uncovering unique insights across China and MENA in a Western conversation, like that of all other non-Western bilateral relationships, demands knowledge of and networks within the region, linguistic skills, and nuanced understandings of each region's complex and intersectional histories. However, unfortunately, in my opinion, the discourse on China and MENA in the West is often too generalized in the context of broader geopolitical discourse, with the implicit understanding that the main lessons learned of these bilateral relationships are that they are a threat to Western interests and norms. Speaking as an American, I have seen how in times when a nation feels threatened, its foreign policy can forgo the necessary nuance to understand a situation's multiple dimensions. These three scholars, Lena Ben Abdullah, Andrea Gazzelli, and Courtney Fung, are actively working across a variety of fields, providing nuance needed to shape effective policy for all actors involved in China-MENA. On that note, I will turn it over to Lena Ben Abdullah to kick off the discussion with her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أنا سعيدة جدا بكوني معكم وأشكر مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية على هذه الاستضافة. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our audience. I am very honored to be participating in this stellar event, sharing the virtual stage with amazing scholars whose works have inspired me for a long time. So I want to thank Chatham House MENA program, the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies, for their invitation. I want to thank Andrea for spearheading this event, this idea, and for Sophia and Mohammed for making it happen. I'll begin my remarks today by contextualizing some of the arguments and findings from my book titled Shaping the Future of Power in China-Arab states relations. So on July 7, 2020, China and Arab states held the 9th ministerial meeting of the China-Arab Cooperation Forum, which is shortly known as CASCAF. So CASCAF is basically the members of CASCAF are members of the Arab League. And so that's a few African countries included there as well. So CASCAF was established in 2004 and was held and has held ministerial forum meetings every 2 years since then. So it's been very consistent in holding those meetings. The 9th edition was the very first one to be held virtually, as you all know, due to the pandemic, and it was co-chaired by Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi. And it ended in the adoption of the Amman Declaration of Action on China-Arab State Cooperation. This declaration, along with the 2018 CASCAF Declaration of Action on the Belt and Road Initiative, tell us a lot and demonstrate to us some of the new approaches and evolving mechanisms of China-Arab states relations. And I will get to some of these in a moment, but there is an important, but it's important also to take a moment to link these to also China-Africa relations and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is shortly known as FOCAC. And FOCAC was launched in the year 2000. It celebrated 20 years of existence this past year. And it is very similar in many ways to the protocol that CASCAF follows, but it showcases essentially how important this forum diplomacy is in China's relations, not only to the MENA region, but also more broadly than that to African continent and also the global South more generally. And so drawing similarities here between CASCAF and FOCAC is important for several reasons. As I briefly mentioned earlier, several African states are members of both platforms. They're both members of CASCAF and FOCAC, which also complicates for us the sort of sometimes clean cut of geographical areas. For example, Djibouti and Somalia are part of both CASCAF and FOCAC. But it challenges us a bit on the North Africa bit in terms of geographically placing or situating all these states and countries that are part of this diplomacy. And the second reason is that, of course, Africa and the MENA region both fall within China's broader South-South cooperation. So it's important to really talk about them together and not, in separate boxes and separate categories. China remains the largest trading partner of Arab states, but we have seen recently a growing interest in diversifying the partnership. I just realized the mic is very far away from me, so apologies about that. All right, here. I was saying that in recent years, we've seen a growing interest in diversifying the partnership and expanding it to include relatively newer areas of cooperation and innovative areas of cooperation, including, of course, cooperation in high and new technologies such as 5G, artificial intelligence, aviation, aerospace, and so on. I want to start here by sharing some of the action points from the China-Arab States Declaration on BRI that I mentioned earlier. And so these are a few quotes that I think will help us get to the main arguments in my book. And so some of these points of the action plan include that the two parties, meaning Arab states and China, have agreed on the establishment
of an Arab training center for the peaceful use of nuclear energy and a Sino-Arab training center for clean energy. Another point is that the two parties support the Sino-Arab Research Center on reform and development and share experience and best practices in governance. Now, the two parties will deepen cooperation in education, sports, public health, arts, publication, and training through the mutual opening of cultural centers and the establishment of sister cities. Another point is that the two parties will continue to enrich and substantiate the Sino-Arab dialogue on civilization and deepen cooperation in eradicating extremism and combating terrorism of all forms. We will work together to build up capacity for maintaining stability. And the two parties will make good on the $300 million worth of assistance that China has announced for law enforcement cooperation and police training programs. Now, what these quotes demonstrate or show to us is that what they have in common is this interest in establishing platforms of cooperation between China and Arab states that center people-to-people relations, that center this concept of human capital development. The word training occurs a lot in these. And the other thing that's kind of really interesting about this action plan is the last point I mentioned was cooperation on maintaining stability. So this is looking at security and stability. And the sentence says basically that the two parties will use the $300 million worth of assistance in law enforcement cooperation and police training programs. So we see this connection between the importance of focusing on trainings, focusing on exchanges, focusing on building networks and people-centered programs between China and Arab states. During the 2020 9th ministerial meeting of CASCAF, Wang Yi stated the following quote, that both sides must stay committed to development to lay a more solid foundation for enduring peace and security in the Middle East. So now this is a very important point here, because we see that from the Chinese perspective, that again, development and security are viewed as as interlinked. So Wang Yi spoke of remaining committed to development as a way to enhance peace and security in the Middle East. And so on the one hand, you have this very connected and linked spheres between the development and security, and looking at security from the perspective of development, that enhancing development is a foundation for peace and security. But what I do in the book is look at development from a different perspective. So what do we mean by development? What is development? How to reach development? How do we get to it? So when we think about China's rising influence and power in the MENA region or in Africa, we're probably more familiar with images and stories of development and in the context of trade relations, infrastructure projects built by Chinese companies, and energy cooperation, especially with regards to Gulf states. So these are the typical ways of framing and looking at China's engagement with these areas, and development here is typically viewed from this sort of material aspect. But from various observations, the crux of my research, especially for this book, is to move the debate on China's growing presence in the MENA region and Africa beyond these material attributes, and to look into the importance and place of social capital, investments in human capital development, and how people-to-people relations produce and are produced by these sort of power relations understood from the network perspective. So these training opportunities, exchange opportunities, what do? They create spaces for built-in networks among elites, among civil servants, law enforcement agents, whatever the topic or the theme of these trainings. And my goal is to develop a framework that takes into consideration these investments as a complement to all the other works that typically view China's relations in the global South, Africa, or MENA region, typically from sort of a material attributes. again, both in terms of China MENA relations and China-Africa relations, and I think mostly, I guess, from the China-Africa perspective, we see that the Chinese government offers thousands of exchange opportunities, training opportunities, and seminars, that is hosting forums and summits and seminar meetings to bring together Chinese and their counterpart elites to discuss in routine exchanges. And so these routine exchanges have become institutionalized either through FOCAC or CASCAF. And the exchanges and professionalization trainings, they become hubs for networks to be formed and strengthened. So they become hosts of knowledge production exercises, because each time there's a declaration or there's a way of looking at something, there's a center for joint research, then the outputs of those are really important to look at, that they are investments in the discourse on talking about China-MENA relations or talking about China-Africa relations. And they also become ultimately, they ultimately also become hubs for or conveyor belts for norm diffusion. At some point in the quotes I was reading from the CASCAF declaration, it was talking about sharing experience on governance, sharing expertise on governance, for example. So this is when we're talking about sort of norm diffusion in a way, norm making and norm diffusion. So traditional and mainstream theories of international relations, which is the field I am trained in, do not capture well enough, do not pay attention enough to these dimensions of engagements. They typically focus more on sort of the visible, the material, the countable. But my argument is that understanding the social human capital approaches and the perspective to power and influence from human capital, social capital, is quite important for the particular case of China's engagement in the Middle East and in Africa. And in terms of a few examples of where we see this sort of relational or social capital approach in China's foreign policy in terms of concrete measures. We see, for example, that in the latest FOCAC, that the Chinese government has offered 50,000 government scholarships, for example, and offered to train 50,000 training opportunities and seminars. And there's a realization that over the years we're noticing, we're seeing, of course, COVID year aside, an upward trend in these investments in human capital development. And there are, of course, also upward trend in terms of the numbers of Confucius Institutes, which are being launched and established in universities and high schools across the MENA region and across Africa. And that's also an interesting, point to compare with Confucius Institutes and their fate in European and North American, universities. So, trainings have become a defining part of China's foreign policy conduct, mostly towards African states. But what we're seeing is also China's relations to the MENA region, to the Arab states, is actually also moving towards that direction. So when we compare CASCAF action plans over the years, we see that the focus on bringing in more students from Arab states to China and the focus on creating more of these people-to-people relations is growing. And so to conclude, I just want to basically reiterate the point that I made about the importance of understanding security and stability from the perspective of development. So looking at stability from a development perspective, that development is or holds the key to peace and security, but to also reiterate the point that in my research, I have tried to open up the concept of development to move beyond sort of the material investments by China in these areas into looking at more human capital and social capital network building in the relations, and try to center that as an angle to understand China's growing influence, both in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the African continent more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina, for those fascinating insights, particularly your points on understanding security from a development perspective are ones that I hope we all can take forward in each of our work going forward. So perhaps I'll hand it off to Andrea next for his remarks. Thank you.
So good afternoon and good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. I would like to first of all thank Chatham House, the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa program, with Reni and Sophie for bringing us here. Of course, the King Faisal Center also for being a wonderful co-host, and Mohammed for taking time to go through our books and prepare intelligent remarks about them. And of course, it's a great pleasure, in that case, to stay here, share the virtual stage with many people that I consider friends before consider them colleagues. So in my brief remarks, I will build on what Lina said, in the sense that what I try to do in my research, and something I try to do in the book, is trying to go to investigate in a way, especially what's beyond cooperation between China and North African and Middle Eastern countries on security issues. What's beyond that, especially when it comes to for Chinese policymakers to understand and try to address the problem of how to protect Chinese nationals and Chinese companies in those countries. My key kind of point, my point of view, and my kind of basic assumption is that China still prefers diplomatic instruments to protect its interests overseas. But at a certain point, which was 2011, Chinese policymakers also started to realize, agreed probably, or they were forced to agree by what was going on in Libya, that a diplomacy-only approach to the protection of their fellow citizens abroad and their assets abroad was not sustainable anymore. And so there was a turning point to 2011, and since then, Chinese policymakers, first with some difficulty, try to react to the ongoing situation, to the crisis, to the sudden realizing that an abstention in the Security Council, about which Courtney probably later will have something to say, led to a massive crisis with about 36,000 of Chinese nationals being in a country that was in the middle of a civil war, and at the same time being bombed by a British, French, and to a smaller extent Italian bombers. And that created, and suddenly they realized that it was necessary to have the instruments to take care of also of this kind of crisis, that only trying to prevent crisis was not enough. So in the book, I try to pinpoint both the way that China is thinking about this issue developed before Libya, and then how it further continued to develop after Libya. Essentially, I show that for a long time, actually, at least in the diplomatic world in China, people were aware that there was a problem in North Africa and Middle East. And the problem was that Chinese companies were not really ready to face sudden political turmoil or war, and they were probably going to face serious problems in the case of something like that could happen again. But until that moment, basically until 2011, yeah, there were a few episodes from time to time of Chinese nationals being kidnapped or robbed. But usually there was seen smaller events that mostly led to attempts to reform the Chinese consular protection system, especially since the mid-2000s, and to, at the same time, basically was a it was a twofold, a two-pronged approach. One hand, reform of the consular protection system to make it more effective, improve the coordination of the MFA with other ministries, and at the same time, there was an attempt to reform, and like actually still ongoing reform of the regulatory framework, regulatory environment within which Chinese companies operate when they want to invest abroad or when they want to join international bids for building bridges, roads, and all the infrastructure that now are the core of the Belt and Road Initiative. Essentially, the main logic, of that reform was that whoever decides to invest abroad or to send workers abroad had not only to take care of the economic success of that enterprise, which usually was financed borrowing from Chinese state banks. So there was money of the state at stake, but also had to ensure that the workers sent abroad were capable of protecting themselves to a limited extent, and especially that they were not sent to dangerous places. And these, of course, on the improvement of the coastal protection system and the changes of the regulatory environment were, of course, happening together in a coordinated way with embassies abroad also helping, of course, giving feedback to the office, to the headquarters of MOFCOM and the MFA in Beijing about what was going on around the world and whether certain countries were more or less dangerous. In a way, this was, however, this attempt was also somehow clashed with other trends within the Chinese bureaucracy, actually toward any growing liberalization in a way, in the sense that the limits, for example, of how much money could be invested abroad with the approval, with the necessary approval from MOFCOM were raised. The sectors in which Chinese companies could invest had been without approval from MOFCOM and MFA had been expanded significantly. So although there was an attempt to make Chinese companies more responsible, also the room for maneuvering was also being expanded. And I'm not saying that I said these contradictory trends caused Libya, but definitely did not help to prevent the problem, the crisis in itself. At the same time, I think we have to imagine China as a country that for a long time has pursued what is the Israeli scholar Yitzhak Shikor called the Japanized foreign policy. Foreign policy mostly focused on business and staying out of thorny security issues. China is a country that has built its own diplomatic identity to a large extent on the idea of not interfering in other countries' internal affairs, especially not deploying troops abroad. So we can imagine also the kind of inertia going on in those years, really preventing to some extent thinking about alternative measures. However, Libya in a way forced everyone to face the reality that there were thousands of Chinese nationals in stable parts of the world, and preventing was not enough. It was also important to have the instrument somehow to intervene in case of emergency. And it brought about a very deep rethinking within the Chinese foreign defense policy establishment about the goals of Chinese foreign policy, and especially the role of the armed forces in that. I would say that the most representative source that I also mentioned in the book a couple of times is this article that was penned by Zhao Keshi, who back then was the leader of the logistic department of the PLA, and also a member of the ever powerful Central Military Commission, essentially saying our interests are global. The PLA must be able to protect those interests, and therefore we need bases abroad. This was 2013, early 2013. So well before news about Djibouti appeared in the media. In general, you can see the change in the debate, and when you see someone like Zhao writing something like this in an open source journal, it means that the debate is long over. There is a consensus. That's the direction that Chinese foreign policy is going. At the very least, there is a very strong consensus that the PLA cannot play a role only in the case of conflicts with other countries, but it must play an active role also during peacetime. And indeed, we see this growing, on the one hand, civilian leaders calling in a stronger way for the PLA to prepare in peacetime. We see that in 2012 Defense White Paper. We see that in 2015 with the protection of Chinese interests overseas become one of the strategic tasks of the PLA. The debate within the PLA also changing, become much more sophisticated. Discussions not anymore about maybe we could, maybe we could not, so on, turn into what is the legal framework that we need to operate abroad? What are the challenges that we face? How is that, very interestingly, how is the use of force? For example, what if our peacekeepers are involved in a firefight? So imagine like in this broader thinking, a more assertive use of military forces, so in peacekeeping missions. What if our peacekeepers are involved in a firefight? How does that challenge, in a way, the core of our diplomacy? How does that, what does that mean? Because these are not just tactical changes. These are these are changes that have much broader repercussion, especially again, in the case of a country like China that for a long time, built a very strong and positive diplomatic image in certain parts of the world based on we do not send soldiers, we respect internal affairs of other countries, we operate through the UN, and so far and so on. Over time, we started to see also changes, not just in the thinking, but also in the actual way that also the PLA started to approach these missions abroad. For example, Courtney also wrote about it with the deployments of combat troops. There was a trial and test process. First small detachments. Let's see what happens. What are the challenges that we face in deploying them? How the countries react to that? Of course, there were other challenges in terms of casualties, unfortunately, among Chinese peacekeepers that also, sowed doubt about what's our direction, what we want to do. We see again, I would say that still it's important to emphasize that, however, even this somehow militarization, if you want to call it that way, of that aspect of Chinese diplomacy remained in a way with a very clear preference for diplomatic tools. So, for example, when we think about Chinese peacekeepers, Chinese combat troops sent to countries where Chinese interests are significant, that does not mean that Chinese peacekeepers are sent to protect Chinese oil fields, for example. Instead, I believe we should look at them as a Chinese contribution to a mission to accumulate enough political capital to shape then the mandate of the mission, for example, as it happened in the case of South Sudan, with the inclusion of oil fields among the targets protected by peacekeepers, not Chinese peacekeepers, by peacekeepers at large. So we see these small changes. We see, of course, the base in Djibouti. I would say that Djibouti has always been one of the favorite potential places for in the eyes of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and so on, the Navy. There were, of course, other choices in Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and so on. But war in Oman, Saudis, close relations with the United States. In Djibouti, there were already many other militaries. All these things together made Djibouti the primary choice. I would say that probably discussions between Djibouti and China on this started already around 2012 when China sent its first defense attaché to Djibouti ever. So that's also where we see cooperation, law enforcement cooperation, defense cooperation, starting to go beyond, strengthening the capabilities of local actors to protect Chinese interests, but also developing something more. And we end up with the base news about the negotiations being broken in 2015, and then the inauguration on the 1st of August 2017. So very important changes. But if I have to again conclude, I think it's important to highlight 2 points. The first one is that if we look at the entire decision-making process, the Chinese approach, we saw at the beginning a difficulty really to realize what was going on and how to approach this problem. But over time, we see the attempt to rationalize and develop a more coherent strategy, which I think today it kind of exists in the sense that I think the priority remains the same before, the preferences remain more or less the same like before Libya. So preference for preventing crisis with making companies more responsible and more sensitive to the environment where they operate, strengthening bilateral cooperation with the countries where Chinese companies are. We saw even very recently with Ethiopia, with an MOU signed between the two countries aimed at in which essentially the Ethiopian government committed itself to improve the protection of BRI projects. But at the same time, and so the military remain a very last resort, something that could be deployed in extreme circumstances, especially in thinking large-scale accidents, not unfortunately one person being kidnapped. That's not, I don't think that's enough to trigger a response. But we still we see this inclusion of the military option. And I think this option is still being developed to a large extent, in the sense that yes, the military must play a role, but how that is going to play out in practice, I think there are a lot of doubts, because of course, using the military is expensive in every possible way, economic way, training troops, deploying troops, politically at home. What if we have casualties? Diplomatically abroad, how the country is going to react to that? And at least my opinion, my understanding is that Chinese policymakers are very cautious when it comes to this sort of issues. So changes, but also continuity. That means that there's still research to be written, and that's good for everyone. But so far, that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for a fantastic overview. And I was particularly interested in your point of sort of security cooperation going beyond protecting local actors, but also developing something more, as well as kind of the fact that all of these processes are still developing inside China and kind of how opaque those processes are, and how much inquiry still needs to be done. So a very motivating and sort of holistic look at those issues. Now I'd like to turn it over to Courtney Fung for her remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our very generous hosts for having me join this illustrious panel. I am no Middle East, North Africa politics expert, so I will have very short comments following those very detailed remarks from both Lena and Andrea, who truly are the experts, and of course Mohammed, who is waiting patiently for his turn to discuss. So thank you again for having me. And I think what I'd like to do is sort of focus my comments essentially within the United Nations space, and in particular at the UN Security Council, where, as we all know, China is a permanent seat holding, veto wielding member. China is celebrating its 50th year at the UN Security Council this year, since assuming its seat. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's very, very interesting to look at this particular space, in the sense that China has been actually quite a consistent player, to pick up on Andrea's point, quite consistent in what it believes its foreign policy principles are, and how it believes our shared future, our future of international politics can best be achieved to promote peace, development, and less turbulence. And in many ways, China has been actually quite a consistent champion of African issues, broadly speaking, of this particular region entering the UN Security Council agenda. I'm very keen to discuss the role of the African Union and other regional organizations in promoting international peace and security. And even when they were leading the council last month, as they were the rotating president of the UN Security Council for the month of May, out of China's 31 meetings, it specifically made a focus to discuss the question of post-pandemic recovery in Africa. So to speak to your point, Sophie, about the broader implications of COVID, but in particular in the African region. And again, China worked very hard, despite US pressure, to lead at least 2 press statements. So the lowest common denominator of an output that could be produced by the Council, a press statement on issues surrounding the Gaza ceasefire and on other long-term simmering problems that the Council faces, like Mali. So maybe what I'd like to do is sort of speak to 2 sort of very broad points to sort of anchor my remarks. It's very important to remember this real emphasis on continuity in Chinese foreign policy at the Council. China is a traditionalist par excellence. It's real belief that the UN Security Council should only focus on real issues of international peace and security. And in many ways, this opportunity then, by sitting with its veto, sitting with its ability to join every single meeting, is that Beijing's able to advance its long-held position that sovereignty should be a shield to protect and differentiate domestic internal affairs as no longer being part of the international peace and security agenda. And China's been also very consistent that it has a real preference, just as Andrea was remarking, and a real reluctance about the use of military methods, the use of force as a particular tool to resolve problems of international peace and security. And this leads to many more opportunities, as Lena was talking about, these concepts of real discussion, joint consultations, the attempts to find win-win solutions through political discussions, other avenues for training, and again, this real emphasis on the non-use of force. But while I say all of that, we have to also be very realistic. It's a top foreign policy priority for Beijing to maintain the UN Security Council as a relevant forum to broker problems of international peace and security in our world today. They lose a lot by the idea of the UN Security Council fading into irrelevancy as we proceed on an ever more turbulent international sphere. So at the same time, China is therefore confronted with these pushes for these more individual-centered, human security-oriented protection of civilians, responsibility to protect, these concepts and these norms that actually put the state itself on a lesser pedestal. That we really shouldn't be so worried about state sovereignty and state control as we should be more concerned about the individual human rights, etc. This has led to real language coming out of Beijing at the Council quite consistently about the need to refrain from getting involved in internal affairs, from separating out domestic issues that do not belong on the Council agenda, and also a real push that there should be no double standards, as Beijing likes to point out, where, for example, more activist, typically the Western powers, are very keen to hold a number of states to account for their human rights standards or their human rights abuses. So if we can sort of take that very broad scope, that Beijing has a very principled position, but yet has to be pragmatic. Where we are at the moment, there is a real push to protect the individual, human security, these types of concepts, right? Moving away from the idea of the state as the only prime actor in international politics. It means that this MENA region gives China many opportunities, but also many pressures. And when I talk about opportunities, I mean in the sense that the MENA region is a second order space for China. If we think about a first order space, first order security questions, those are those that would turn up directly in China's backyard. Literally, the DPRK or Myanmar as typical issues that are bumping onto the Security Council agenda. And there's a great expectation that nothing will occur in either of these cases. There'll be no UN Security Council action without China's explicit support. But the MENA region is a space for second order security questions for China. By no means am I saying that this region is unimportant, but in having long-standing American, British, and French foreign presence in the region, very strong regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., there is a question then that China can exploit this little bit of latitude, a little bit of space, to produce some very interesting foreign policy experimentation and some real diplomatic opportunism out of Beijing. So if we just think back to last month, when China again was in charge of the UN Security Council agenda setting that month as the rotating president of the council, China took a real opportunity to really embellish its remarks and its belief that it is a fully engaged partner pushing forward on multilateralism for today's era. Very, very sure to make the point that the question of the Gaza ceasefire, the ability to produce this ceasefire and maintain pressure for this ceasefire to occur, it was China that kept inserting this issue back on the Security Council agenda. And China was very clear that it was pushing for a ceasefire and calling for political solutions, much to the chagrin of a Biden administration who had made it clear that it was now back at the United Nations, ready for multilateral diplomacy. And yet it was the Biden administration that had worked very hard to sort of prevent any type of joint Security Council action. And so in many ways, this kind of shone a very bright light on the US pressures on China regarding Myanmar, which China does not see as a coup, but as a major cabinet reshuffle. And to also for China to then push back and say, well, who's actually acting responsible now? Calling for a ceasefire, calling for greater humanitarian access, calling for these political solutions should at least be the bottom of what we ask for, the base of what we ask for. It should be a very practical request that we as a council can get behind. And so in many ways, this sort of presented this opportunity for Beijing that is not a leading state in this particular question, but presented a real opportunity for Beijing to show itself to be a responsible player, much in contrast to perhaps its ability to say, well, where was the United States on this particular issue? So I think this is sort of what I mean by this real opportunity for this like diplomatic jujitsu, its ability now to sort of move out and try and find gaps that it can utilize to, again, burnish China's reputation and its foreign policy principles through the UN system. But at the same time, as I say this, of course, the region presents real pressures for China. As both Andrea and Lena acknowledged, we think about the massive events that have made history in the last decade, and we think back to the people-led movements of the Arab Spring, many of these inducing instability for China just at the time as it was truly going global and stretching out abroad. And in this sense, this particular spot of the globe has seen some real foreign policy experimentation for Beijing at the council. So, for example, China's been very cautious about sort of pushing the Security Council to breaking point, very reluctant to utilize its veto. A veto, of course, means that you bear the responsibility for stopping any sense of international momentum or international cooperation through the council. And China has used the veto oh so sparingly, up until we've now entered the last decade of the Syria crisis, where China has cast 10 vetoes alone. So out of less than 24 vetoes, China has cast 10 vetoes alone on the Syria crisis question, out of a real commitment to be very clear that UN Security Council interventionism should not be producing foreign-imposed regime change, especially in these cases where the states themselves are accused of mass human rights abuse. China will not brook any type of movement now that could potentially open the door to seeing the state itself being dismantled or pushed out. So that's been a real sort of moment, a real turning point in the way that China has perceived and utilized its particular authorities at the council on this particular country crisis of Syria alone. Just as Andrea acknowledged, the Libya question from about a decade ago again also highlights this policy flexibility. China's very surprising move to support a joint ICC referral. So the whole council got behind this idea that there should be an ICC referral for Gaddafi and other leading members of the Libyan state. And again, that China was willing to abstain shortly thereafter on a very intensive no-fly zone plus plan. Ultimately, all of these steps by the council paving the way for Gaddafi's removal and indeed regime change to actually occur. So again, you sort of see these departures, right, from these sort of real Chinese foreign policy tenets that you must support the host state, i.e. you must make sure that the host state consents to actions, that we have to make sure that there is a real sense of respecting state sovereignty, a reluctance to use these highly interventionist, non-consensual tools like the use of military force and the ICC. And this Libya question is still leading to headaches for Beijing. In many ways, the Libya crisis highlights that Beijing's caution about the use of force should not be ignored. It's not like there has been this very smooth transition for Libya in the last decade. At the same time, China is still carrying around this stone on its back as it's trying to sort of heed the interest and the use of the ICC in this particular case. I think, and we can move on to just two more examples before I wrap up my comments. It's also very important to think about other tools that China has used for its foreign policy levers. So for example, they're a very keen supporter of the UN peacekeeping regime. China has led some policy innovations on questions of peacekeeper safety and security, and has a keen interest in this regime as the second largest contributor out of the permanent members of the council. And as it's the largest contributor out of the permanent members of the council, and the second largest budget contributor behind the United States for the peacekeeping budget. But China, for all of these reasons, can be seen as a key node in the UN peacekeeping regime. And in the last 30 years of China's deployment, they've been very consistent to dispatch enabler troops. So troops that are more tail versus tooth. So those that are providing medical, logistical, engineering support, for example. And it's only in the last sort of, since about 2013 onwards, that we've seen this real movement where China has started to finally deploy combat troops. So these are the troops now that actually will have to use live fire to protect civilians, to protect assets. China was very keen to make sure that protection of civilian infrastructure and oil infrastructure was included in Security Council resolutions mandating operations into South Sudan, for example. But in these activities where China has finally deployed these types of troops into Mali and also South Sudan, this has led to a real, a real sort of pressure for Beijing, in the sense that they've now had their first combat deaths. 3 Chinese peacekeepers have been killed by what has been termed as malicious acts, i.e. deaths that are not induced by illness or by accident. And in the case of South Sudan, it was an attack led by South Sudanese soldiers that actually led to the conditions that actually killed 2 Chinese peacekeepers in South Sudan. So again, all of this has led to these sort of questions, right? As Andrea was, talking of, these real questions about, well, how can China maintain these foreign policy principles about the need for host state consent, about the need for host states to be responsible for peacekeeper safety and security, while at the same time China is bearing the ultimate cost of having actual peacekeeper deaths. And so it's leading to this sort of questioning and this rethinking about how Beijing can better engage with local population groups, what this implementation for these types of mandates really mean, and whether or not you can truly rely on the host state in ways that China, as a state that has championed the belief that official channels can lead to great political outcomes, whether or not this can actually work. And we also have to remember the last example on this, just as the UNAMID Darfur Sudan peacekeeping mission is winding down, we again saw massive innovation coming out of Beijing in the mid-2000s, 2008, where China was very effective in terms of wrangling host state consent out of Sudan. And indeed, China was the first non-African troop to deploy on the ground. So again, it's not to paint this very negative story about China's diplomatic activities and its pressures through the council to address these problems. But I think it's to highlight that this experimentation is still very much ongoing, and that there are real challenges that will definitely be following Beijing over the next decade as it seeks to strike the right balance between holding on to consistent principle, pragmatically applied in a part of the world where it is only growing in importance for China. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for your remarks. And thank you as well for touching on what our other panelists have said as well. It's a fascinating prism with which to view China's diplomatic activities on the UN Security Council, and a very important point that it's the second largest budget contributor as well for peacekeeping, one I did not know earlier. So thank you again for all of these multitude of insights. I'll now turn to Mohammed Al-Sudari to lead us as a discussant in discussing what has been said so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I'd like to express on behalf of my colleagues at the King Faisal Center for Islamic Studies and Research, our greetings to the audience, as well as our thanks and expressed wishes addressed to our friends at Chatham House to continue to hold such events in the future. This is in fact the second jointly organized event we've had with them on China and Middle East themes, with one that was held last year to much success on technology and security in the triangular relationship between the US, China, and the Gulf region. Now, as a discussant, I've been tasked with responding to these 3 presentations and behind them the 3 books. But I will try to keep my comments brief so as to ensure there's more time for the audience to pose its questions and comments. And we're getting an ample amount actually over the past half hour. As a whole, and I'm partially here piggybacking on Sophie's opening words, these presentations challenge a dominant view in the public discussions that are taking place on China, depicting it as an active and supremely strategic actor reshaping a relatively passive environment like the Middle East. And here, of course, other manifestations of this type of discourse is the narrative of captured states by Chinese money that we see routinely in the media, as well as more open academia, open sources in academia. Now, more specifically, I believe that these presentations, all sort of hovering behind them, have two common themes or ideas. The first is that there is really no one China, not in the political sovereign sense, but rather we are dealing with a China that is really an immensely complex and fragmented phenomenon. When the Chinese footprint in a given region is discussed, state and society are often collapsed onto one another and imagined to act in a holistic and organized whole. While certainly some would aspire for such a reality, asserting, for example, in Beijing, that government, the military, society, and schools, north, south, east, and west, the party leads them all, we are still left with a state constituted by different functional constituencies, networks, and bureaucracies competing over resources, agendas, and policy outcomes, and all notwithstanding the decades-long effort by the Leninist system in Beijing to rein in this fragmented authoritarianism. Here I'm borrowing a bit from Kenneth Lieberthal and Michael Oxenberg, that has really shaped Chinese politics since the post-Maoist era. And of course, these efforts are expressed, and Andrea Giseli touches upon this in his book, through greater efforts to impose coordination between different bodies of government, as well as institutional restructuring. However, as again Giseli's book shows, when we look at the debates taking place within this imagined uniform state, whether, for example, comparing civilian elites in the Communist Party of China or with the military brass, we find differences and contrasting visions and views on questions of non-traditional security and interventionism. Of course, other examples that really highlight this fragmented character of the state include questions about extending debt to foreign entities, so that we find that typically, and this is shown in research, how diplomats associated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are eager to waive and offer debt relief, while their counterparts, for instance, in the Ministry of Commerce or the banking institutions behind them, are very hesitant to do so. And even complicating this picture further is the role played by local governments in international outreach, as well as cities, not to mention the role played by state-owned enterprises. So we're really dealing with the behemoth that's comprised of many operating and moving parts. And even when looking beyond the state, which is often how China is thought of in this sort of open discussion, we have a wider society, which since the inaction of the going out policies in the 1990s, has proliferated across the globe, establishing diasporas and opening corporations and companies in various different places. And many of these are, of course, animated by their own interests, whether profit-driven ones or in pursuit of their own dreams. And all of this really raises the question, to what extent do they act? And here we can put, of course, aside the efforts by the party state to co-opt and monitor and guide, right, through various entities and organs, that they really act in accordance with the state's interests and wishes. You know, we have here multiple examples to really take into consideration that challenge this view, whether, for instance, again, referring to Ghazali's book, the habit and practice of private entities to go to risky areas despite repeated warnings by the state. Or even more broadly, the disjunction that exists between the direction of Chinese investments globally and the watchword of the state with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. That is to say, even though there are changing trends in the direction of investments away from North America and Europe in the last few years, we still see the Middle East and Africa, which are primary arenas for the Belt and Road Initiative, peripheralized in terms of the direction of these outflows. And one could even argue that despite the state's rhetorical efforts to redirect investments, the critical element in changing these investment patterns was probably the heightened securitization of Chinese investments in the West. Right, so this all sort of complicates the picture. And even another additional example comes from the work of another scholar who's not here with us, Wang Yuting, who has written a beautiful ethnographic sketch on the Chinese debate. And she shows through this in-depth work how a lot of the community itself has carved out its own space and pursues its own disjointed interests, sometimes in conjunction with, and many times wholly unfettered with the interests of the state. So in all, when we speak of China's interests in the region and China advancing its interest in the region, we really should take a much more integrative approach. That is to say, the interests of China according to whom, and what is advancing these interests. So that's sort of the first key point. The second sort of point that I want to raise is putting greater emphasis on local actors, local governments, organizations, and societies who are not passive recipients on the one hand, or unitary actors on the other. They create or they have enabled the rise of China's interest frontiers. Again, this is borrowing from Giseli's book. And they decide how and where Chinese capital, assets, and peoples go. It is Dubai's adoption of the Singapore model and the establishment of a free trade regime that has allowed it to emerge as a hub for Chinese companies based in Jebel Ali. The type and direction of CPEC infrastructural projects in Pakistan are also largely decided by input from the party of Tehreek-e-Insaf, right? Even though, for example, Chinese entities have had very different opinions and thoughts about where to direct investments, what would have greater sustainability and profitability over the long term, the political assessments of local actors in Pakistan have overridden that. And ultimately, it's just to emphasize this, it's the local political configurations that also politicize, whether domestically or internationally, the Chinese footprint. And this again is typically and always really an extension of the internal and domestic politics within those places, which are often imagined as being in pursuit of national goals. So we can think of multiple examples for this. For instance, the debate that has emerged about the Iran deal and the 25-year partnership, which scholars like Lucille Gear and Cabrera have extensively written about. And actually, the criticisms that have been raised about that agreement have largely originated from critics of the regime externally, but also critics of the reformist government internally. And oftentimes based on a mischaracterization of what the agreement itself has entailed. We see similar dynamics at play, for example, with the expected goal of Chinese reconstruction in Syria, which is typically exaggerated by the government in Damascus, and something that Dr. Giseli and I are exploring in future work that will hopefully come out soon. Or even more relevantly in the case of the Gulf, in Kuwait several years ago, when we've seen very similar debate to that which took place in Iran with regards to the possibility of over $500 billion US investment in Kuwait that would be done in exchange for ceding several islands for Chinese military use. And a lot of this disinformation emanated and emerged internally within Kuwait from different political parties that had been unsettled by the arrangements that were taking place with regards to Chinese BRI projects there. So we can therefore say that local actors have a big role in mediating both the material aspects as well as the optics of China's footprints, which also, of course, plays out in terms of affecting Chinese official stances on humanitarian issues and interventionism, as Courtney Fung has discussed in her book, as well as in the presentation. So in other words, they are far from being passive actors in this overall story. This also holds true when we turn our attention to training programs of officials, police officers, under the rubric of, for example, the China Arab Research Center and Reform and Development in Shanghai, which raises really a number of questions, which I think Lina bin Abdullah has raised in her book, whether these are as depicted sometimes in certain research and think tanking circles and in media circles as conduits for the diffusion of ideology and a so-called China model that resonates with a particular authoritarian disposition, or as appears to be the case in a budding literature, as points of technical and governance exchange and norm diffusion actually desired and requested by local actors, and wherein the resonance really lies in emulating Chinese developmental successes and reproducing its modernity in their own contexts. And I can say anecdotally, if you look at, for example, official views, official tours, and people who are destined for training going to Jingdangshan, which is, sort of the seat of the Communist Party of China, and they're presented the history of the party and are exposed to its narratives, with those who go, for example, to the designated party school in Pudong, a lot of them prefer to go to the latter, because at least in that arena, they're able to really see directly the type of modernity they would like to see emulated in their own homelands. So to paraphrase Lena, how do we get development is really an overriding question for a lot of these local actors. So I think with these two broad points in mind, which I think are sort of the connecting strand across these presentations, I'd like to sort of raise maybe two smaller ancillary points. One is whether we can really speak of a Chinese grand strategy in the Middle East, given sort of the fragmentation of China in terms of state and society on the one hand, and sort of the activity and also the fragmented character of local actors on the other. It really produces a situation that we cannot really characterize as necessarily an expression of a holistic and well-studied approach emanating from Beijing. And we see this actually very well captured by the way in which the BRI project has unfolded across the region. In the Gulf, for instance, we see in Kuwait, in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, really a replication and reproduction of very similar infrastructural projects that would suggest that when they all come online, the ability for them to capture trade value and to redirect volumes of trade will be quite limited. And in fact, it shows that there is very little coordination and synergy taking place, despite efforts on the part of Beijing to do so. And it really shows, moreover, the importance of focusing on the domestic element and sort of assessing and shaping how Chinese material footprint is expressed. And of course, this is not to say that we should completely put aside the possibility of the formulation of quote unquote a grand strategy. This is of course, but I don't think we're still there yet. We are seeing the development of Chinese thinking on a variety of different issues, which is again sort of raised effectively in Dr. Giseli and Dr. Fung's books. If we look at the debates on interventionism and sort of security involvement in the region, all of which seem to have their starting point from the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2011, which also I think highlights the role of uncertain variables, as well as black swans, for instance, in redirecting debates and discussions. So these are things we should really keep in mind and sort of avoid the tendency of projecting onto the future current trends taking place in the region. There are variables that might shift Chinese involvement, as well as things that are not necessarily of a security dimension or aspect. For instance, shifts in technology might very well alter the patterns of trade and economic engagement between the two regions. And the second sort of ancillary and point, and my last one, is, and I think this is shared by the other scholars on the panel, is that there is a need really to challenge the tendency to view China's engagement and presence in the region through a solely securitized lens. There is, a sort of a habit that repeatedly or recurrently emerges in a lot of the discourse presently of viewing Chinese assets, projects, and interactions with local actors through threat calculations and as being an extension of great power competition. We forget, of course, when taking on or sort of adopting this lens, the very normal tendencies of this multifaceted Chinese state or fragmented, quote unquote, China, as well as the concerns, objectives of local actors themselves. Local governments are pursuing development and prosperity for their citizens or voters, if you want to take a more narrow and cynical approach in the case of where you have democratic participation. They're seeking technological modernity, and they are also out to obtain, in the words of Liang Qichao, the Chinese reformer from well over a century ago, wealth and power. So I will stop my presentation there. Thank you for the speakers again.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for those wonderful reflections, and I hope that you'll join us all in wielding some of those insights into the Q&A. I think that was a really excellent sort of holistic overview of much of what was discussed today, particularly your point about, can we speak of a Chinese grand strategy in the Middle East? I would venture to ask, can we speak of it anywhere that China engages with bilaterally? And if so, sort of what are the incentives for Beijing to treat things as sort of these holistic strategies? And sort of your other point on sort of, we need to reflect as scholars and policy practitioners on the exceptionalism with which we treat discourse about China's bilateral relationships and about China itself. So that's a really excellent summary. And so I want to thank our speakers all again for their fantastic points and insights. It seems that we've already have 22 questions in the Q&A, and we have only a short 15 minutes left. So I will try my very best to condense some of the themes that I've been seeing that are already being spoken about. And in the interim time, if the folks on the panel want to speak to a different question as well in one of their responses, you can feel free to acknowledge it. So going to some of the earlier questions that came in regarding China and Iran, I know that this has been sort of a big headline maker in the West as well, with the 25-year agreement rumors last year, and then kind of the confirmation after Wang Yi's visit to Tehran that this agreement was being signed, sort of debunking of its significance. So I'd love to hear if anyone wants to speak more about significant economic activities or relations between China and Iran, how those have evolved, and what you think they might look like in the future given these recent diplomatic endeavors. So I'll pose that question kind of to the group to get us started, and then I'll have one other regionally specific question before diving into 2 or 3 more general ones. Thank you. Anyone want to speak on China-Iran stuff? Andrea, I see you unmuted.
Maybe I can just say 2 points, although it's an important, of course, related to the topic of China in the MENA region, though it's a bit out of kind of the scope of what we've been talking so far. When it comes to China and Iran, I think China's basic goal toward Iran has not changed since, well, even I would say since the 70s, pretty much, with the idea that Iran plays an important role in the Gulf, and against the background of Gulf politics, the trends there should be decided by regional powers, not by external powers. Back then, the unspoken enemy was the Soviet Union. Today, the target of this is the United States, and that logic has essentially not really changed regardless of who's in power in Tehran. I believe that when we look at today the 25-year agreement that was signed recently between the 2 countries, I see probably, especially against the background of worsening of growing tensions, between China and the United States, I think that's still the driving logic. I guess we still have to wait and about what happens not just in the region but also in Iran with the elections there. Of course, the deal between them is something I've been written a lot about, but we actually know very little, especially beyond the fact that it's not binding. There are a few targets and general guidelines that have already materialized in some very low-key agreements, I think, on cultural exchange. So the real kind of hard politic content of this agreement is still, we're still waiting for that. So growing activities, Chinese activities in Iran, also that honestly with the sanction, everything, if you look at what Chinese sources say, they say that Chinese companies still have a lot of problems in dealing with Iran, and those issues will remain for a long time unless really Iran goes back fully into the global economic community. So they are important, but exactly what they mean and what's the direction of the relationship, it's difficult to tell because it does not depend simply on China and Iran. That would be my general point on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those comments. And I think you sort of tie in the intersectionality with which that issue is discussed sort of internally within the region. and sort of put it out of the black and white that it's usually seen in. So one more sort of question on regionalism, or regional focus before we move to some broader concepts, would be for those on the panel who would like to provide insights into China's view on Israeli apartheid sort of more internally, and how that issue is viewed from a political lens, not just sort of beyond the Security Council perspective that Courtney shared, and instead taking it more internally into how China sees that relationship. Thank you.
I think the one that wrote the most on this is Mohammed, actually, among
Yes,
us.
I was gonna suggest he should be the one to speak first. I should say who I'm passing it off to, because you are all too polite to go first. So Mohammed, I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Sure. Although I'd be very interested in hearing Dr. Fung's thoughts about it as well. But
Absolutely.
my sort of understanding is that the last time that China had actually had an opinion on Zionism and settler colonialism in Palestine was in the Maoist era, when it had voted for the UN resolution on Zionism as racism, or a resolution that contained that paragraph, which was eventually rescinded by the international community, I think in 1991. So the position of sort of post-Maoist China has consistently been over the last 30 years or so, since the global consensus had emerged out of Oslo, the Oslo peace process of a two-state solution, is to support the emergence of an independent Palestine. And Chinese actions for the last 10 years have seen a lot of efforts, both internationally and regionally, to reaffirm that, whether in terms of sort of the overseeing the 4-point peace process and trying to mediate and arrange for a meeting between Netanyahu as well as Abbas. And in terms of sort of upholding the idea that the West Bank is territory that will be designated for a future Palestinian state. For instance, there was an issue a few years ago on banning, allowing Chinese workers to operate on settlements created by the Israeli state illegally in those territories. So overall, the approach that China has adopted is one very much in keeping with its traditional approach. That is to say, deep respect for state sovereignty. And in the case of the question of Palestine, the existence of two states, but very little comment on what's actually happening internally in terms of the configuration of the state or settler colonialism or apartheid.
Thank you, Mohammed, for those insights. And I think that that also brings us back to some of Courtney's comments, especially with the 4-point plan that she referenced that was being proposed on the Security Council from China as being kind of the lowest common denominator in terms of types of plans that had been circulated out, and kind of the sort of lowest possible point. Courtney, I wonder if you have anything else to add in or contribute on this before we move on to a different question. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. And just oh so briefly, I mean, I do think, again, it is a very important space. I mean, China's been very consistent about the need for a two-state solution. And again, we have seen some fluctuation in the way that China's gone about trying to achieve this, some very tentative movements, invitations from Beijing to have both Israeli and Palestinian sides meet in China for talks. So this is reproducing this concept of good offices, that China tries to host these lower pressure, venue-oriented opportunities. They're the same thing that they've been doing for Myanmar, the same thing that they have been doing for Taliban and Afghanistan since about the last 5 years or so. And this ability for two sides to come together and discuss, and China acts as a host. Again, but this is a very difficult position for China because it's not traditionally had this very deep political security, military presence, well thought out multi-layer solution for this particular question. As Mohammed points out, that it's been something that China's had a consistent position on, but it's not been something that it's had to intellectually, policy-wise, figure out every single detail. And even though it's had a special envoy in the region since 2002, and it's now seeks to upgrade that appointment, now they've appointed a vice foreign minister into that role, an ex-vice foreign minister. it still is at the position of trying to explain what China's ideas are for the region, trying to explain that it wants to listen to various regional stakeholders, but it's not able to fully articulate a means forward to try and lead to a greater settlement of this particular question. We're not at that point yet. Again, perhaps more in the experimentation phase, but still obviously a question mark to be watching over the next stretch. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for that comprehensive answer. And I think, given this debate, it's very useful to start with these two kind of politically charged, regional focused issues to get this expert panel's more nuanced view at the situation. So kind of taking it home in the last 5 minutes of our panel, I wanted to bring up this really interesting question from Ernesto Bram that reflects a couple of others in the Q&A, which is that there's a lot of attention so far in this panel that's being paid to China's strategy and actions vis-a-vis the MENA region. And I know many of you have done work looking at things sort of from the MENA region perspective. So to what extent is there consultation among MENA countries regarding China policies? So would you be able to sketch out kind of what broadly the main attitudes or schools of thought in MENA are regarding China? And going from there, another question in this question, how do you think that opportunities for MENA can cooperate with the EU sort of as a partner or as a peer on some of these issues? So I'll kind of leave that for someone kind to jump in on, and don't be too polite here.
I'll jump. And then I can only, I have to say, disclaimer is my focus is mostly on how China look at the region rather than how the region looks at China. So, I try to do what to say what I can about that. My impression is that, and at least this is how China look at, different countries, how they see the situation in the region, and how they see China's role in the region. And also other powers, Russia, the United States, the European Union, and so on. Is that essentially there is a bit of, at least on the Chinese side, Chinese speaking, seems to me there is a bit of frustration with regional developments, how different countries in the region have been behaving so far, in the sense that instead of really improving coordination among them, focusing probably more on domestic economic development, so to address some of the root causes of the Arab Spring, the result has been that many countries such as Turkey, Israel, so far and so on, Saudi Arabia also, and others have been actually playing a much more proactive, have been their foreign policy have become much more proactive, with many Chinese observers that kind of see that as a result of domestic problems that instead of being addressed at all, they're kind of externalized. With leaders using domestic problems to, foreign policy to distract domestic audiences. And against this background, there's the impression that we have on the one hand, the United States, that it's somehow withdrawing, but it's not really withdrawing. In any case, will remain an important presence in the region. But how it will go from being the dominant power to one of the main powers in the region, this transition, it seems bringing more instability than anything else. And at the same time, there are the Europeans, which in theory could play a role. And my impression is that China would like to see the Europeans more engaged in the region, especially in certain ways and in certain issues, such as Iran, for example. I think China hoped Europe to play a more active role in bringing back the JCPOA, especially during the Trump presidency. And today it's, with the fact that there are tensions between Turkey and Greece, plus, before it was the problem of migration, now there's the issue between Turkey and Greece. The impression from Beijing is that Europeans have still a lot of problems, a lot of things on their plate, and their effectiveness as regional players, or at least as regional players that can bring some sort of stability, remains fairly limited at the very least. But at least this is what, if one summarizes a bit the view from Beijing, probably others have to say more on the regional point of view.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for those insights. And I think that that gives kind of both a rehashing of the major points of how we've seen China look at some of these questions, and also alluding to a lot of the sort of MENA facing opinions on the issue. So perhaps to give a little bit more nuance, especially from the like North Africa region, I'd love to call in Lena and put her on the spot for a couple of additional comments before giving 2 more questions to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you. So just to add on what Andrea was saying, in terms of MENA region countries' policies towards China, I mean, I think that a lot of that would have to be looked at in terms of bilateral relations. So I don't think that there's necessarily sort of a multilateral platform in the ways, you know, we discussed this also in China-Africa relations. You know, the story goes, China has its Africa policy, but we don't know if there's an Africa policy towards China. You can always go back and look at China's, you know, policies and papers, white papers on its policies towards Africa. They're always readily available and they're updated frequently. And the story is that we don't have the other way around. You know, but honestly, if we look at it from the bilateral perspective, we will actually see that there is a lot being done in terms of these local actors from different countries trying to, you know, just to give an example, when you look at, for example, Morocco or Tunisia or Algeria, each one of these governments will have their own national development plan, whether it's looking at sustainable development or tourism industry or other parts. And what you'll see in terms of consultation with China is, in many ways, and recently you see trying to tap into Belt and Road Initiative language in order to associate development plans from these countries and try to launch and get projects through the Belt and Road Initiative to sponsor or to fund or to start projects in that way. So I think we'll have to just move to more bilateral consultation mechanisms rather than expect a Maghreb China or Maghreb policy towards China or an African policy towards China and so on. And then in terms of cooperation, I mean, I think that that's also a very important question. And we've seen in the past, we've seen a lot of examples on trilateral cooperation, and you have an EU agency and Chinese agency collaborate and cooperate with, say, a host country in North Africa or in Africa. But somewhat, I want to link this to a point that Mohammed mentioned earlier, and I think is a very important point. There used to be a time when all this cooperation was actually a thing, like it just happened and it was okay and it was a good positive thing and it was encouraged. And this is quite fascinating, because not long ago, when a lot of us were starting to do research on China's foreign policy in the global South Africa MENA region, just about 10 years ago, the discourse was that China was quite plain, sort of quite the free rider, right? That it wasn't actually putting in the work, that it was just enjoying what the international community was fronting in terms of bills, in terms of costs of global governance and engagement globally, and that China was just reaping off the benefits, just being this sort of back seat rider, free rider. And the switch happened very quickly. Now, you know, a lot of us were actually rushing to show that actually China wasn't sitting back; it was doing a lot of things that mattered. But now we're trying to say, no, it's not. Forget that. So it's quite interesting that how quick the shift happened. And now, you know, China is framed as, and these activities, you know, China, large China, you know, that these are framed as threats in a way that these projects, you know, it's almost, it's very difficult today to speak of, let's say, US, China, Africa, trilateral cooperation. It's almost a no-go, and for reasons that are very unfortunate, because like I said, not long ago, you know, the discourse was, let's try to get a lot of these things going on because it just makes sense. But now, you know, the discourse switched very quickly on us scholars, but so we're trying to catch up all the time. But I wanted to mention that you know, that it remains the case that EU China Africa, for example, trilateral cooperation is a little bit more feasible today than, let's say, US, China, some African country trilateral cooperation. But if the trend continues the way we see it today, there might be more, of a discourse of rivalry around China's involvement in the region than a discourse on cooperation, which, yeah. So those are my 1.5 cents.
Lena, I would say that's at least 2 cents. You're being quite modest, and we really appreciate that sort of also frank discussion of the history with which this sort of Western discourse has also framed China as this free rider of some of these like American security blanket and other types of like global liberal international order type sort of conversation. So I really appreciate that. And so to kind of link, I'd like to tie 2 questions together here for our final ask for those of us who can stick around just a little bit longer, as there are already nearly 30 questions in the chat. So I'll try to answer what we can. So the first is an interesting series of 2 or 3 questions that touch on the role of Chinese private security contractors in the region, which is very niche, but obviously this is sort of the panel that would speak to it, and whether or not you expect Chinese private security contractors to make their presence felt in some countries in the MENA region, taking into account perhaps large-scale investments there, and perhaps even tying that in with involvement in Libya as well. And so that's sort of one stream of questions that I'd like to ask. And then the other sort of stream is more on the incentives that China might have. And this might be more for you, Courtney, in terms of engaging not just with Libya, but perhaps also with Yemen or with other issues that are of regional importance to MENA on the National Security Council, and taking perhaps a more active stance that might be in some ways moving the needle geopolitically on issues that might be too politically charged or have too much complicated political weight for Western countries to engage in a deep way. So one question on the private security contractors, and the other one on other potential actions for China on the National Security Council, potentially also touching on Yemen. So those are 2 big, broad areas that encompass at least 4 of the questions. But if somebody would like to kick us off, that would be wonderful. Perhaps I can start
go
with
the private.
Yeah, go with that. Exactly.
Yeah, so I discussed a bit the role of private security companies in the book. There's also another article out in Armed Forces and Society on that. To the question, will Chinese private security companies play a larger role in the region? The answer is yes. But the real question is, how will they do that? In the sense that probably there are legal constraints to what Chinese private security company can do. It's very essentially they cannot or they're not explicitly clearly allowed to carry and use guns at home and abroad. And there have been attempts or proposals to reform that in late 2011, and there was no real follow-up. It was part of a set of proposals to, generally speaking, improve the protection of Chinese nationals abroad, which involved also, changing how embassies work and so far and so on. But the part on private security was probably, I think, was the only one that really did not have any follow-up. So essentially, the way that we can look at the role of private security or Chinese private security companies more as consultant and intermediaries between, probably a big SOE, state-owned company, or another Chinese company that wants to buy them, and probably local security contractors, local in the sense of the foreign country where they end up operating. And so they're working between, somehow mediating between these two, the customer and the actual providers of security. They also provide soft training. They do that to companies, to embassies, and so far and so on. So really more like consultants than anything else. The reason why they've not been allowed somehow to develop into something more similar to their Western counterparts is, at least according to Chinese sources that are available, is that there is the idea that doing that would probably cause more risk than anything else, because they would come on the one hand more expensive, which means that many Chinese companies in any case will not be able to afford their services. At the same time, having Chinese with weapons abroad, it's like they will be exchanged for being soldiers, which is a big problem for all the reasons that we discussed during the panel. At the same time, there is the problem of what happens if they shoot someone, or they're shot at and they're killed, or they kill, or they killed, or they're killed. That could create significant friction with local communities, friction that in a way or the other already exists, especially in areas where the presence of Chinese companies is already significant. Probably you would, in some companies, some of their customers would be more able to protect themselves. But overall, you will not really change that issue. In the broader picture will not change. And plus, you would bring in potential diplomatic problems, that that do not really make sense for China to take to face, or given already the other problems that it has, especially as most of the problems are somehow the same that prevent China really to think about a more proactive use of the military. So there's a big problems. Again, we have to think that these proposals of reform were put forward in 2011, so immediately after Libya, when policymakers really had pressure to find solutions to that, and they still refused to make any real step forward. So 10 years later, no other kind of Libya took place, which means that probably to some extent policymakers are also happy with the situation. Probably they will again play a role as consultant, but I think we're very far away to see like Chinese people with guns abroad and going around in Toyota pickups or or anything like that.
Thank you. Yes, Andrea. And as an American, it brings me great pain to hear those images applied to China, as I have seen that personally from American forces in the MENA region. So welcome. Great. So then I'd like to pass it over to Courtney there for the sort of more UN side of the debate, and then give us short closing. Thank you so much, Courtney, for staying with us.
Sure. I think maybe I'll focus these questions exactly as you'd set them up on this question about Yemen, Sophie, and that will help narrow my rather rambling remarks. I think, again, this goes back to this question about what role does China want to play? If it wants to play a role and utilize the various channels available, whether this is state to state, sub-state, non-state opportunities, exactly how will it do so? It knows it wants to be involved in broader questions of mediation, of which Yemen is now one of the about 10 live cases of mediation that China is working on currently. It knows it likes the concept of mediation because it definitely moves away from any question of force. None of this responsibility to protect, protection of civilians, which apparently now does mean the use of force and connotations of that. And it's aware that it can work on conflict management. You don't have to work towards resolution, which means long-term planning. You can just manage a current problem. But again, as China tries to do this type of mediation effort in Yemen, and it's tried to some small level of success to try and bridge divisions. 5 years ago, it attempted to bring the two sides together in whatever combination would be accepted through the UN. And that didn't exactly work out with the rebels, viewing that the UN was too partial. China was too partial to the Saudi Arabian state. China still is between this rock and a hard place. It has these great concepts about mediation, political solution, humanitarian aid, the need for a ceasefire, the idea of working through regional, for example, GCC-led initiatives, the idea of focusing all the energy and supporting the UN Special Envoy. But again, it has to accept that it has priorities on promoting a very strong relationship with Saudi Arabia in terms of the Saudis being keen supporters of China's core interests, and China is a keen supporter of their core interests. The accepting point that, of course, Saudi Arabia is the focal point for BRI initiatives in the region. And so again, this idea of exactly how you want to do these great concepts about mediation and political solutions, et cetera, in a pragmatic sense, I think we're yet to see. We do see, again, sort of these movements towards this quiet behind the scene diplomacy, these use of good offices, and these consultative interventions that are still happening with the acceptance of the Saudi Arabian state. So therefore it is not intervention. But But this is still a case of sort of figuring it out as we're going. And I just do want to say one last point to definitely speak on the point that Lena raised. As students of Chinese foreign policy a decade ago, China would have been criticized for not turning up. And I think China's now reached the point that it's now getting criticized for turning up and apparently not having all great solutions for what are many long-term massive headache problems that have plagued the region, the questions for human rights, humanitarian standards globally for decades. So there is this little bit of this sort of sandbagging China with everyone's problems now in a way that arguably often puts a little too high expectation for a state that itself admits that it's figuring things out as it goes. And indeed, a large swath of the Chinese foreign policy literature has pointed out, especially as these books do, that China is figuring things out as they go. And there is this large debate, exactly as Mohammed noted, about which sets of Chinese actors pursuing which sets of interests to which sets of outcomes. Not that that type of nuance can be caught in much of the public discourse, but it is really surprising. And I definitely want to back Lena on that point by how fast this public discourse has changed, in particular on questions of Chinese foreign policy. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for your remarks. And thanks to everyone for joining us for such a wonderful panel today that brought so many nuanced and realistic insights on China's relationship with MENA and China's sort of bilateral relationships more broadly. We are so grateful to have all of you, and we hope you'll continue to join us for the MENAP program events in the future. And thank you again, Mohammed, to you and your colleagues at the King Faisal Center. May this be one of many Zoom and or in-person events that we have together way into the future. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.